Hello, and welcome to the 2020 City Imagine series presented by the Word on the Street Toronto. Thank you so much for tuning in to this first event in our series, Cities Gone Viral, Assessing Canada's Response to COVID-19. My name is David Alexander. I'm the Festival Director for WOTS, and I'll be your host this evening. The Word on the Street is a festival of books, ideas, and imagination, but we're also more than a festival. WOTS is a community. Much has changed for our festival since the outbreak of COVID-19 hit Canada. We asked, and you told us what matters most about the WOTS experience: discovery, inspiration, connection. Our community is creative and resilient, and we're excited to bring you the word on the street at home through events like this one. Before I turn things over to our panelists, I would like to acknowledge that the Word on the Street operates on land that is the unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Takaranto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people with long histories on this land. We are privileged to live, work, and create in this territory, and we must act with awareness and solidarity. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you occupy wherever you're tuning in from. Tonight is the first event in a series of free City Imagines discussions about cities and the people who shape them. Before we start, a few words about the next two events in our series. We're pleased to announce that this coming Monday, former Chief Planner of the City of Toronto, Jennifer Keesmaat, will interview Dr. Karen K. Lee about her new book, Fit Cities, My Quest to Improve the World's Health and Wellness, Including Yours. Then on July 27th, we have a co-presentation with the Festival of Literary Diversity, Black Alchemy, How Our Stories Transform Cities and Spaces. The Fold's Jael Richardson will moderate a discussion featuring musician Drew Brown, author Eternity Martis, and placemaker and author Jay Pitter. You can find more details about these events at cityimagines.ca. As this panel gets underway, Word on the Street staff will curate questions submitted using YouTube's chat function, and a selection of those questions will be answered towards the end of the panel. So without further ado, I'll introduce our moderator, Shawn Micallef. Shawn is a weekly columnist with the Toronto Star, co-founder of Spacing Magazine, and an instructor at the University of Toronto. He is a frequent commentator on urban issues and is known for his passion for the city, its geography, architecture, culture, and people. Hi, Shawn. Good evening.
Hi, David. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Okay. The sun is out, and we're still here.
All we can ask for. I'll turn it over to you now. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I'm really glad we're doing this panel today because cities sort of seem like at least one of the ground zeros for this pandemic, and a lot of the issues that are playing out around the world kind of seem to really intensify in cities because we're all pretty close together here. So we have a panel of three great people, three great writers, and I'm just going to introduce them and then we'll start talking about this. Thea Lim is the author of the novel An Ocean of Minutes, about a woman who becomes a migrant laborer to escape a pandemic and save her lover. It was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. Her writing has been published in Granta, the Paris Review, and The Guardian, Best Canadian Stories as well, and others. She lives in Toronto. Nora Loreto is a writer and activist based in Quebec City. She is the editor of the Canadian Association of Labour Media. Her next book is called Take Back the Fight and will be published in October of this year. Nora has been tracking COVID-19 deaths in residential care nightly for 4 months. And finally, Shree Paradkar is a Toronto Star race and gender columnist. She's the 2018-2019 recipient of the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy. She's the author of Betrayed, My Cousin's Wrongful Conviction for the Murder of Her Daughter, Arushi. She has been a journalist in Bangalore, Mumbai, Singapore, and Toronto. And she was recently awarded 2 Amnesty International Media Awards for human rights reporting. So hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
And this is also my first time ever moderating something through my machine here, my machine, which seems to be my portal into the entire world, and from doing exercises to stuff like this. So I'm glad you're all here for the ride. So I thought I'd ask my first question, kind of like just how are you doing today? Like, I find that my days are roller coasters sometimes. Like, some days are good, some days are just feel like it's the end of the world. How are you doing? And like, what's your feeling about the world right now? Maybe I'll ask, maybe Thea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I try actually not to think about how I'm feeling too much. Try to disassociate from that. But when I was thinking about this panel, I guess maybe uneasy, I think, would be the best way to describe it. And I was thinking about how I feel in the context of Toronto. And one thing that has been happening a lot in my neighborhood, and I think across the city, is whenever I walk around in most of the parks near my house, there are lots of tents set up because people are living in the parks now because it's the only safe place for them to live. It's not the first time, I think, that we've seen things like that in Toronto. I remember Tent City, you see it every winter, but this year it seems far more widespread. And I think part of the kind of unease and really horror of that for me is that it seems like it's becoming ordinary, like it's an ordinary way for people to have to respond to the fact that our city has failed their kind of basic needs. And I think when you really start to think about the scope of the problem, which existed very much so before coronavirus, but is now so much intensified by it, it just becomes so overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been such a, I guess, in many ways, like a domestic experience because everyone stays home. Seeing the parks fill up with tents and people, it's like one of the apart from the void of an empty city, it's like one of the demonstrative things you can kind of look at. Thanks, Thea. Nora, how are you?
I'm okay. I actually just had a couple of days of vacation where I got to go to like 40 kilometers out of the city to a little lake at a public network of summer cottages, which is something that exists in Quebec, and I don't think it exists anywhere else in Canada. So it was great because obviously it was a break from the grind. I mean, I've had my two kids home since March, like all other parents. For most other parents, they didn't go back to school when schools opened here. And it hit me that you could totally pretend that there was no pandemic on a lake away from the city, really, surrounded by people. We were not at all remote or isolated. Like, at the beach, it was quite a small beach. And so there's people around, but, we're socially distancing or whatever. But it felt like, oh, that was all just a dream. It was over. There was nothing. And then we came home, and as folks that live right downtown, we are park people. So we go right to the park when we got home. And it's just like, oh, wow, like, has there been an outbreak since I've been gone? How have the deaths changed? How have the illness has changed, which has partly been warped by my nightly looking at these numbers. This was the first 3 days I've taken off since April 12th, I think. And so I'm okay, but it's an unease. And I, like everyone else, I am doing what I can to will a vaccine into existence.
Yeah, I find sometimes walking in the ravines in Toronto, because the trees block everything else. It does make the pandemic seem like a dream.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't woke up yet. Shree, how about you? How are you doing?
Well, I'm privileged. We have a ravine in our backyard. And so, I'm very, very aware every time I look out at the trees, that what we have is something that in pre-pandemic times, I would think about, I need to go live in the city, it's not working out, being far away. But right now, the whole idea of commuting or the whole idea of distance has become meaningless. Not being in the core of the city is no longer an essential to the rest of functioning. I also feel that in journalism, we are so used to this generalized sense of anxiety that what I feel now is just like a deepening of a very familiar sensation. So, same, despite the privileges, same issues, Nora mentioned education, what are the kids going to do in September? childcare, how am I going to continue my job with all the responsibilities, balance that with the children. And then also very specifically questions of my parents' Canadian residency. They're not in Canada, they're in India. And what is the fact that they can't travel here? What will it mean to their residency requirements, as you know, because they have to be here 2 years every 5. And so will that then mean that their residency will be canceled because they didn't meet those requirements? And unfortunately, because we don't have journalists who are affected by this in the media, these are not questions that we look at. So again, just have all of these little anxieties there. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a dad in Malta, but I actually didn't think about that. He was supposed to come this summer, but is not, obviously. It all kind of, those relationships that airplanes allowed us to have now somehow seem like extra tenuous and yet another worry. Well, let's jump into it and let's talk about some of the stuff that you've been working on. In many ways, COVID has magnified the issues that already existed and made them worse, and brought things to a head. Things that might have been under the radar for a lot of people. Maybe there were articles written about it, but because it didn't touch people personally, it was easy to ignore, or just kind of like, that's not such a big thing. And now they're huge issues. Nora, when you started tabulating the deaths in long-term care homes, that information seemed really hard to come by. Can you tell us about when did you start tracking it, and how did you go about it?
Yeah, so it was, as I said earlier, about mid-April. I was recording an episode of my podcast with Sandy Hudson, and I mentioned the amount of deaths that have been reported in Quebec, because there had been a bombshell story out of the Montreal Gazette that 33 people had been found dead at the Heron residence, which is a private for-profit care home owned by a company called Catassa. That also actually operates other residences, including student housing in Ottawa. And that was just the beginning, because at that point, the death counts within long-term care, I mean, it took weeks for those death counts to start rising the way that we know that they have. And so what I was doing every night was combing through public health information, which, depending on where you are in Canada, is quite different. Ontario is particularly messy because, I mean, there's dozens and dozens of public health units, and the data is kind of like all over the place. If it can load, because they also have a contract with Microsoft, making their data really difficult to load for some reason. But I was also using media reports, of course, and really relying on local small town newspapers. I've always been a supporter of local news, but this process has made me really see how local news absolutely is critical to tabulate these kinds of experiences and to talk about these kinds of experiences. And then I was relying on information that I could glean from obituaries. And that was a big part of it in Quebec, was that I was reading through obituaries every night, and obituaries where it was specific that someone had died from COVID and where they had last resided. And so patching all this stuff together, it gave me kind of like an intimate look at where death was happening. And of course, death is only one way to measure the impact of the crisis. There's also outbreaks and infection rates and how they're isolated to so often low-income communities, Black communities within our major cities in Canada. And as I was staring at this nightly, I was asking myself, where are these questions, or where is this reporting happening in the mainstream press? I mean, there were some stories, of course, there's some journalists have been really dedicated in doing this work, but it seemed to surprise a lot of people in the media establishment that death was happening in the way that it was happening. In some cases, reaching into double digits very quickly. And so now looking back as to where we are, there are 3 homes in Canada where there are more than 100 people who have died as a result of the virus. There are dozens and dozens where people, more than 20 people have died. And it's been really shocking. And then looking also at who has been affected for employees, both healthcare employees, but then also employees within different workplace outbreaks. The vast majority of people who've been affected, vast majority, have been not white, and the majority of healthcare workers have been Black. And so this is I think the story of the pandemic, is these low-income, precarious, feminized jobs that are so often worked by people who are Black, and or holding precarious status, or within the meatpacking industry, there's people who might not have status at all, might be temporary foreign workers, stories of people who came to Canada through the famous Roxham Road border crossing in Quebec, who are now working as personal care workers or working within the meatpacking industry. And it's just this stunning example, picture of how messed up Canadian society is. Mm-hmm. And I say this not as someone who is surprised by this, because of course I write about this regularly, but I think that the lack of response from politicians on specifically how this has decimated and really injured low-income and racialized communities and Black communities specifically, I think like that is going to be for me what happens next. How do we continue to talk about this crisis, knowing that it has so specifically targeted and hurt communities of people within this country that don't have the power that other communities have, and why have we allowed it to happen in the way that we have allowed it to happen?
What do you think the differences were between places like homes, businesses, but maybe the long-term care homes specifically, of places that had no outbreaks or were able to contain it quickly, and then the places where it seemed out of control?
Yeah, that's I think the question that will be answered by inquiries. But certainly, if you look at Quebec has had a crisis situation in long-term care for a very long time, for more than a decade. And in fact, our government, the Coalition Avenir Québec, was elected on the promise of reforming long-term care. So this is not something that is surprising. People voted for them, even though, I mean, there was nothing in their background that suggested they were going to be able to fix it. But Quebec has a very strong, very big public system, and the majority of the death that we've seen in Quebec has happened in that public system. That being said, the stories of like disgusting conditions, people dying in their beds, the reports that were made public by the Canadian military, those showed that there was a difference in care from private homes to public homes. That even though there may have been more death in the private homes, and then there's also like age averages in Quebec's March break, that it happened 2 weeks earlier than Ontario's March break 3 weeks earlier. But the conditions in private care, a lot of these for-profit homes just sound horrible, and the relationship that they all have to one another is that the workers were working 2 or 3 jobs in different institutions because they're trying to hobble together a paycheck, because they're paid so low. In Quebec, they're paid barely above minimum wage. It's the same thing in a lot of the rest of Canada as well. And in the homes where there were not as many deaths, I mean, some of it's luck. I've talked to journalists out in Manitoba who talk about how it was just pure luck that they, got out of the crisis the way that they have. But, there was also some very excellent reporting done by CTV by a journalist whose name is escaping me, Solarina something. She covered how one home in particular in the GTA did not have any deaths. And her report is quite interesting because it showed that the management, not only did they make sure that they had the proper protective equipment for everyone and that they were taking all the warnings seriously, but it was a home with a lot of residents who were Chinese. And so the home's management were really looking towards China in the early days and seeing how they were responding, saying, there's familial connections. We need to make sure that when this comes to Canada, that our residents are taken care of and that they're kept safe. And I think that that question of foresight, having the resources, having the staff dedicated, and having adequate pay helped to avoid some of the worst ravages of it. But it's very, very complex, and I think that the inquiries are going to, of course, explore that question.
Yeah. One last thing. You mentioned local news was important to helping you find this information. It seems confounding that it would be that hard that you had to go to such a variety of sources, unofficial, official ones, obituaries to get this information. I think a lot of people probably think there's just some database somewhere that you just call up. Did it become easier over time? And Shree mentioned the anxiety of journalism. We're always anxious about the decimation of local news, right? We're lucky in Toronto and some of our bigger centers that we still have, big newspapers, but the local papers that are disappearing, that information will be gone. So did it become easier over time? And long term, do you think we'll have a better system of tracking this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It did not become easier. Well, okay, it became a little bit easier because a lot of the large national newspapers started to kind of do similar work as well, although we were all piecing together the same data. So the only thing that really made it easier is when the deaths stopped, right, or started to really drop. So my work went from being 30 minutes every night to 2 hours and a half every night to back down to about 25, 30 minutes a night. And that's not a result of the sources. That's just the result of how much fewer deaths there are right now, which is great. The thing about local news is that when you're reporting about a community that you're from and that's small, there's a desire to actually talk about people who've died, and so you get a fuller picture of a lot of the victims because they are part of the community. And through that, I mean, one of the things that has been the most frustrating to me is how little information we have about worker deaths in healthcare. And that a lot of the worker deaths were only made public because of their union. Their union often was the one that broke the news saying a member of our union has died, they were this and they were that. And they were speaking to the families to make sure that the information came out was, what the families wanted them to have. But I have at least 3 people named on my list that I had to find out from family members or from friends quietly who they were, because that information has not been reported on. And we also have numbers from Ontario's Ministry of Health, for example. It just says 7 workers in long-term care have died. My list, I have more than 10. And so it's who is not there? How am I supposed to find this out? I've been in touch with the Ministry of Health in Ontario. They said it's Public Health Canada that's got to tell you. Public Health Canada hasn't been back in touch. And I'm not being paid to do this work, right? So the lack of attention on the people who sacrificed their lives to save other people in this pandemic, that's a real shame. And I think that journalists have a responsibility to make sure that this is being reported. And I don't know if anyone else in Canada has that list. I mean, there's a list that you can go to my Twitter feed and you can see just the list of whose names we know and whose names we don't know, what their background was, what their age was, and where they worked. But for that information, it's one thing for 8,000 deaths to not be tabulated very clearly for a whole bunch of reasons that are obvious. But for us to not know very much about the 25 workers that have died in this country is just such a shame. So,
yeah, I noticed that Maclean's last week started a project where they wanted to write. It's an ambitious one to try to write obituaries for everyone who died in Canada. So maybe that will.
There's some of that work. I mean, I should shout out the London Free Press because they have been doing a lot of local obituary work, for people that have died within the London region. So there is some of that out there, but you have to go to 50 outlets to see the whole picture for all of Canada.
Thanks. Shree, as a columnist, you've been writing about the pandemic from a variety of angles. As a fellow columnist, I found that the last 4 months has been the hardest time of my writing career. The news moves so fast, and how do you find something? How do you write about this in a way that gives something that provides a perspective that is not out there yet? So it's been a challenge. And one of the running themes that has already come up today is the inequality of how we're experiencing this, despite all those signs and windows in Toronto, at least at the beginning of this, of we're all in this together. We're all in this together, but we're all in this together very differently. So I wanted to talk about two of your recent columns. And the one that just came out last week in the Toronto Star was a piece about massage parlors and how the workers there are being affected by the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? But also, how did you zero in on that story? I think as writers, sometimes we get asked, how do you find your ideas? How did you come across these people that were having a very particular experience during the pandemic?
It's a good question. This one came to me. I didn't go out seeking it. As you know, you get a lot of people who are, there's too much racism in this city, really sad, and very sadly, and not enough people writing about it. So I find I have the terrible burden of having an inbox which is full of all of these stories and not really even being able to respond to all of them. This one came because a colleague of mine asked me if I could do it. She was doing something else, if I would be even interested. And what I've found since George Floyd's murder is that, racism has become this in thing. And when I find that people who don't normally write about racism are now writing about it, then I think my job as somebody who's always writing about these issues is to now go deeper and not just talk about the things that, oh, do you face racism? Is there systemic racism? We all know this exists, but to show, it's my job in any case to show all the myriad ways in which oppressions affect our society. But in a case where people are talking about anti-Black racism and just discovering that world for themselves, I think then it's my job to take it in directions that other people are not. And in this case, now through the pandemic, slowly, but eventually we did start talking about migrant workers, but the understanding of migrant workers was mostly that they're farm workers. And very little attention paid to workers who are female workers who might be in their unregistered massage therapists, body rub parlors, in very vulnerable situations, who have been made vulnerable through not just the police, but bylaw officers. And what I found Ellen Lamb of the Butterfly Network saying is, don't just defund the police, but also defund the bylaw officers, because I heard stories after stories. I read a survey in which they had interviewed scores, dozens of women, and who talked about bylaw officers kicking down doors, just they're not allowed to lock their doors. This was and I spoke to one person who is vulnerable, but she was willing to speak to me on condition of anonymity, to say that she was once, a man came in and choked her because the door is open and she's not allowed to lock the door by law. And she's not allowed to lock it unless there is somebody inside, unless she has a client, and in which case she has to have some sort of a timer on the outside, not a timer, but a notice that will say what time she would be coming out next. And so once she got a ticket because a bylaw officer pushed the door but didn't push it hard enough. And so he said, oh, it was locked and here's a ticket. Another person wrote about getting a ticket because there was some kind of a fold on a table mat, or something. And so there are some ridiculous examples of these infractions. And now all of this has been going on for years. Then comes the pandemic. First came the anti-Asian racism, because majority of the women in these parlors are racialized Asian. And so you had the whole anti-Asian racism because, this China virus and Wuhan, whatever they wanted to call it. And so as it is, they were losing clients. Then you have the pandemic closures. And then after the Toronto Public Health said that these parlors can reopen with certain conditions attached, they found that people who did open, they still got ticketed. And the one woman I spoke to got ticketed $880. And so it's egregious. And it showed the levels of injustice that, while I live in my privileged ravine-facing house, is not reality for so many of us in this city. That's why I chose that story. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm just thinking of bylaw officers and trying to think, apart from the recent pandemic and ticketing people who were, too close together, when have I ever thought about bylaw officers? And like in middle class Toronto, it's when there was like a overly officious one ticketing off leash dogs in one of the fancy parks, like in
exactly.
Or something.
Exactly.
Like this is a whole level of authority, a discretionary authority that goes under
That's
the
right. That's right.
Another piece you wrote about maybe a month ago, maybe it's 2 months ago. I don't know what time is anymore, like everyone. But back in the spring, you wrote about what I sometimes call the Great Trinity Bellwoods freakout of 2020, when that first warm weekend, after a few months of being pent up, Trinity Bellwoods was this kind of carpet of hipsters carousing and drinking a little bit, and then later on maybe peeing and other things in people's driveways, but that's another story. And it was a big deal. It was on every, led every news story that day, that weekend, and you wrote about it that got a lot, in a way that got a lot of attention. And speaking of your inbox, your poor inbox, you pointed out that the hipsters, who were largely white in Trinity Bellwoods, were probably treated a lot differently than if a different group of people were doing the same thing, maybe in another part of town. Can you tell us about how you approach that event, and maybe some of that reaction that you got from people? Because that had a long, sorry to use this phrase, the long tail of people chattering about it for weeks, and your article kept coming back up and being part of it.
That's right. So I'll take that as a two-part. One is the story itself, and the other is the backlash. At the time, it was a Saturday, I think, that everybody met at the Trinity Bellwoods Park. At the time, there were 10,000 cases in Toronto, with an average of about 200 increases a day. That was also a time when our test efforts were flailing. Experts were talking about goals of 100,000 daily tests in Ontario, but the average at the time was like 8,000 to 15,000 a day. So we were really falling behind in terms of just the illness. Meanwhile, I had friends of color who were sharing their experiences privately about being overly surveilled just in public spaces. There was a friend of ours here in Scarborough. He's Tamil. He's walking with his children. He's taken them for a walk. All social distancing protocols. It's suburban. He's on the sidewalk. White guy on the lawn tells him to just get off the sidewalk, berates him for not following social distancing. And, he's not used to, you're ambushed. Like, you're not, and you have your children with you. You don't know how to respond. So he doesn't say anything, but now obviously this is festering, right? I have friends out in Brampton, in Mississauga, who talked about, they were sharing stories about how these kids who are playing cricket have been fined, and perhaps rightly so, right? Like, yeah, you're breaking these social distancing rules and maybe you should be fined. And then you have Muslim people. It was around the time, I think it was Eid that weekend, and Muslim people were also sharing stories about, in certain neighborhoods, there were already cop cars there, even before the celebrations began, almost like a monitoring of making sure that, nothing's going to get out of hand. All of that would be fine. It would just mean, not all of that, not what happened to my friend who's Tamil, but, the vigilance would have been okay if it was then going to be applied equally. And then we see these images coming out of Trinity Bellwoods. And look, to somebody like me, this pandemic didn't become about racism because George Floyd was murdered. It's always been, right from the beginning, it has always had this thread of racism underlying, through it. And so I see an image like that, and no doubt it's not just white people there, obviously, right? As I say, fools come from all races. And so no doubt there are people from various races out there. But there was an overwhelming whiteness that you saw, which had it been an Afrofest, for instance, we would have seen very differently. We would have noise complaints as they did with the Afrofest. We would have had, fears of, idiocy, criminality, and all of the negative stereotypes that are attached to Black people along with that. And so I think I thought what I thought was a very obvious column where I said, look, these are all the different ways in which people are getting penalized and being surveilled. Homeless people are getting, charged $880, like homeless, Police the Pandemic, which maps how people are being surveilled during the pandemic and who's being charged, found that homeless people are being charged $880. You would think a story that had that line, people would be most scandalized that we are charging homeless people for social distancing. But no, to move to the response, what really upset people, far more than anything I had said in the story, was a headline that was not put there by me, but that I agree with, and it was a completely fair headline, because it said white COVID-idiots. And so the anger was not look at all the unfairness, look at all these idiots, look at, how we are policing people differently, and look at how we are criminalizing the poor, but it was, how dare you say white COVID-idiots? To the extent that then it went to the Media Council, now my employers have to get in, now they have to file a defense, and somebody else, and there were many letters after letters after letters, and eventually the Media Council said, no, this was not discrimination against white people. And I sometimes wish, and I've never said this openly because it's irrelevant, but I sometimes wish should I have said on Twitter, hey guys, it was a white man who wrote that headline, and it's not, so the perception of who's doing the telling also matters, right? Because I'm an immigrant from a developing country, and it's like, so I'm an outsider, how dare I say this? And so the backlash made it even more foolish. Mm-hmm. If all of these thousands of people had done something really idiotic, then the backlash showed that they were not alone in their idiocy. That there is a whole lot of other people who have their priorities all wrong. Like they were worried about the fact that it had the word white in front of COVIDiots. Mm-hmm. So yeah,
it feels like maybe changed a little bit in Toronto and figured out how to make the parks work at least. On the weekend, went for a really long bike ride up the Humber Valley all the way to Steeles and then back down Black Creek and then back downtown. And there was just like really nice family picnics and gatherings that were like, spread out and good. And it's like after all these weeks of turmoil, it feels like we've maybe figured out how to be humans in a pandemic. Do you find in the Scarborough ravines, have you seen like, are they busy? Are people like, spreading out and living in them as their public living room kind of?
The beach here is pretty full. I'm not seeing a lot of distancing happening at the beach. But the trails are, there's some distancing. My husband's a runner and, he doesn't see a lot of people when he's going there. When we're biking around, there are people, but it's not too bad at all. And the weather is good and there's more options for people to go to. And it seems to me like people think it's over. People with certain levels of privilege think that the pandemic is now over and they've almost gone back to pre-pandemic socializing, because we've now had discussions about who is most affected by the pandemic. And it's mostly the deaths, as Nora said, were mostly from long-term care homes. And it's people who are most marginalized. Then if you don't identify with any of those demographics, then you think you're immune. And that I think it's a little dangerous.
Yeah. Thanks, Shree. I should say to our audience out there, who can't see, but you're there. If you have questions, write them in the little box, and we'll get to them in a little bit. So you can participate too. Thea, your novel. I'm really glad you're here because you're a fiction writer, and I think the three of us kind of deal in nonfiction mostly, perhaps. And you approach things from the other side, or in my head, it's the other side. And your novel involves not just a pandemic, but also migrant labor. Like a part of our pandemic here in Canada, in Ontario, that's really been a terrible part of it. And you wrote this obviously before COVID. Can you tell us how you did your research for this novel?
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say first, actually, thank you so much to Nora and Shree. I just loved hearing about your research. I just appreciate your work so much, and the intellectual and emotional labor that it costs you to look at the places that other people aren't looking at. So my novel, it starts with the pandemic, but actually most of the story takes place 17 years after the pandemic. So what I wound up looking at in order to build the world of my novel was not so much infectious diseases and stuff like that, but what are the long-term structural impacts of something like total social collapse. And then where the plot wound up leading me was to migrant labor, because my protagonist is a migrant laborer. I should probably disclaim here that she travels not across geographical space, but temporal space. There is a time travel element there. But I wasn't trying to write about an imagined world. I was just trying to find a way to kind of magnify our world so that we could see it in a different light. And so I wound up looking at a lot of the experiences of migrant laborers in our current world, because another thing that was important to me is that I didn't want people to think that I was trying to write a dystopian novel in the sense of, if we're not careful, this is what's going to happen. I really wanted my readers to understand that I was writing about a world that already exists, that we maybe are involved in, maybe aren't involved in, but we could probably think about more. And so when I was trying to figure out what the life of my protagonist looked like, I was looking at places like, I looked actually a lot at Leamington in Ontario, the migrant workers there. There's a great documentary, which is actually a little bit old now, El Contrato by Minsa Lee. It's old, but basically just as relevant as when it was made. I looked at the conditions of domestic workers in the Middle East. I looked at people who were working in tech factories, like places like Apple factories in China. And I also spent a lot of time looking at construction workers in Singapore because I grew up in Singapore, and actually a lot of my experiences there, just sort of witnessing migrant labor, were what informed my interest in migrant labor in the first place. So, you know, a pandemic finally happens, and I sort of feel like I called it down, and I sort of was like, probably shouldn't have written about a pandemic. But I have to say, there's a great unhappiness in discovering that the world you wrote about, that was meant to be an exaggeration of our own, is actually just as bad, or probably not even as bad as the real world. And I think that's sort of what I have kind of been grappling with. And I think sort of what has become clear, and my research has been front of mind for me all these past few months because of all the things that Nora and Shree talked about, that it has been very much a lot of hotspots around migrant laborers that have been really kind of driving the outbreak. For example, one of the biggest hotspots in Canada that is called Ground Zero is in Windsor, Essex, right? Again, because of the migrant farm workers. And in Singapore, they're actually considered to have done a good job of containing their outbreaks, as has Canada. But their second wave was really also driven by outbreaks in what they call foreign worker dormitories. And just like in Canada, those are places where people are living in very bad conditions. They're living very close together. It's impossible for them to physical distance. So when we think about what does it mean to be said that you contained an outbreak well, I think we have to ask ourselves what we always have to ask, which is, who are we talking about, right? Who has it been contained well for? And really, I think sometimes I've had sort of responses of readers where they've kind of looked to me for answers. It's been suggested that I predicted things, and I didn't predict anything. I really was just looking at what was already happening. And I think in some ways I feel less equipped than anybody to sort of figure it out, just because, yeah, I think you hope that things get better when you write about something like that, not that they'll get worse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Windsor, Essex County, and that issue was pretty much under the radar of mainstream media for a while. But the Star, I think the Toronto Star did a series maybe in 2017 on migrant labor and sent a few reporters down to Leamington and reported on it. So all this was known, in the last few years, the conditions in these houses where people stayed. And I think with, people I know back home, the stories were kind of trickling out. It took a while. But even during, as this, was exploding, how slow it was. Like, you had Doug Ford on the TV kind of begging farmers to do something, right? Like, come on, farmers. And that was another moment where it's like, isn't there already a system in place like that can take care of this? And like, and there's not.
I mean, yeah, and we talk so much about essential workers. What does it mean for somebody to be considered essential when they're not treated as if they're essential? I mean, it's the same for the people working in long-term care homes, right? That's an essential job, and yet they're treated as, as disposable as you possibly can. Like, for example, we can't even keep track of who's died. I mean, it doesn't get much worse than that, I think.
Yeah. Well, now that you've been living in an actual pandemic, would you go back? Would you write the book differently? Like, now that you have, this strange lived experience, and have there been moments of like your life imitating art? Like things that you wrote that you've seen play out in this kind of uncanny way?
If I could go back, I wouldn't write about a pandemic. I would write about a world where only good things happen. I wrote, in terms of what I would write differently, I mean, I think I'm mildly, I think, uncomfortable with trying to think about like, oh, art imitating life, just because, like I said, I didn't invent any of this. And I think this is so much what we've all talked about, right? That these are all things that existed before the pandemic. It was just sort of whether or not you were, moved to look at these things. But in terms of kind of what I would have done differently, I wrote actually an essay in Guernica a few months ago about this. So one thing that a lot of pandemic narratives have in common, including my novel, is that if you think about like 28 Days Later, or even kind of stories that are supposed to be more realistic, like Outbreak or Contagion, the virus is always like really grotesque. Like it's something that's very visual. There's a lot of pustules, like people's faces are melting. And my novel totally does the same thing. And I think what this kind of implies, intentionally or unintentionally, it was certainly unintentional in my novel, is that our empire is kind of so strong and so foreboding that it would take something really monstrous to kind of take us out. And I think one of the most terrible things that coronavirus has forced us to confront, well, maybe not terrible to confront, but certainly disturbing, is to realize how, like, the empire is like held together with chewing gum. Even I think people who sort of thought they were doing fine, who were like, oh yeah, the system works for me, I think have been forced to confront how it doesn't work for them at all. And it all just sort of goes, sliding down like cards. And I think if something good does come out of this, what I think about often is, will this help us to better understand, I guess, in a Marxist sense, really, that everything that comes into our homes comes through a process, because that's something that maybe we're lucky enough to not think about all the time and to not care the process through which it comes into our homes. Like, will this experience enable us to better understand the conditions that we live under, that we've been so disinterested in for so long? Or will we maybe just keep walking our dogs on the ravine and not think about it? I mean, I guess time will tell.
Yeah. Something I was wondering about is, and this is a question for all three of you, what role, and because this is word on the street, and we can talk about the role different kinds of writing plays in affecting people's view of the world, and because this is the pandemic that we're living in, the focus seems to be so much on news and nonfiction and reporting, and we already talked about some of the holes in the reporting, or how difficult it is to report some of this stuff. What role do you think that fiction has in helping us understand something like this?
Well, I'd be very interested to hear what the nonfiction writers would have to say, because I think I'm about to betray my kind. But I think what I've been finding, like what I heard so many people say, especially in the early months of the pandemic, was I just can't finish a book. Like I keep trying to finish books and I can't. And something that I've been thinking about so much is how one of the great demands of fiction is, number one, drama. And I think one of the fascinating things with coronavirus is how banal it's been in some ways, like how, if you've been paying attention, nothing about it has been surprising, right? And then another one of the demands of fiction is resolution. And it can be a happy resolution, an unhappy resolution, but there has to be some kind of closure. And I think in some ways, at this particular moment in time, I think about that kind of striving for tidiness as maybe being a little bit dangerous. Like maybe we should be more comfortable kind of living in a world where there isn't closure, where there is kind of a wildness and where we can't get sort of the comfort from stories. Maybe it's okay to be reading the news, living in that world. Because I think what I have found is that I love stories. I will always love stories. I will always write stories. But I think sometimes when I look at a narrative right now that is particularly tidy or neat, it feels, in this particular moment, flat.
Shree or Nora? Fiction?
Fiction for me, look, I'm very much in awe of people who can write fiction, because to me, I feel like I would have to be supremely relaxed, high on weed, and and have no care in the world to allow my brain to start a fantastical journey. What I'm trying to say is it would be extremely difficult for me to have that free reign of imagination. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's because I inhabit a world which is so fantastical in its own with everything going on, the news, it's fiction to me. Then if it can only be a relief and escape. Like, I do not want serious literature when I'm done my day. I don't want anything that's going to teach me anything in life, strain any bit of me. I'm good with Harry Potter. I'm good with, and not think about J.K. Rowling. And I'm good with, I try to watch movies. And once you're doing anti-oppression work, whether it's books, whether it's movies, you can't help but see those. You see those transgressions all the time. And so sometimes then I start watching what I call British drama, where it's at least white on white crime, and I don't have to worry about seeing some racial transgressions there. So for me, fiction then becomes really low level fiction, in the sense of I just want a break from reality. And as reality starts getting more and more strange, then the fiction has to get simpler in my life.
I mean, I can definitely sympathize with that, because I set out to write something fantastical. I set out to write a time travel novel, and I wound up writing about global economic inequality. So,
for fiction also seems like a complete mystery to me, and I don't mean mysteries like as also a kind of fiction. The funny thing for me is that so just before the pandemic, my partner was doing a sabbatical in the United States. So I was on my own with the kids, and I had dedicated every night time to read fiction, because it's just, I mean, I don't watch TV. I don't watch movies. That's why I'm a little obsessed with Twitter, is because that's literally my escape, which is kind of weird. But I was reading fiction all the time. And so I went through this incredible number of books. For me, I think it was 3. And then all of a sudden I started to have to not do that, because I was counting how many people had died every night with COVID. And so I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of fiction that I would like to read. And I mean, I would love to be able to write like Shree. I don't think I ever probably could pull off good fiction unless it was just satire of what I would normally write for news. But I feel like we do need to have the stories of the pandemic told. And so I've been thinking a lot about short stories and of poetry, and of the things that are less involved than complete stories in a novel, to help kind of give that sense that everyone is seeking right now, that allows it to be a little bit open-ended, but also to understand that we are all in this together. Every single, I think of my career and how it's just been, I'm like, oh my God, I'm launching a book in a pandemic, oh, woe is me. And then I talked to the lifeguard at the beach while I was away, and she's an international lifeguarding champion, and her whole life has been torn upside down. And I'm like, oh, woe is her. And then it's literally every person you talk to has this kind of incredible disruption that's happening in their life right now. And I think that that's where I would love to see fiction. And Thea, I'm really excited, actually. I'm totally going to read your book, because this idea of what happens after the pandemic, everybody's life has been modified in some way by this. And whether that is a massive modification or if it's just inconvenienced for a couple of months, this is a redefining moment. As a political writer, the redefinition I'm interested in characterizing and in pushing for is towards a society that is more just. But from the fiction world, it's like who's falling in love because of the pandemic? Which babies aren't being born because of the pandemic? Which babies have ridiculous pandemic names, and then they have to explain that for the rest of their wacky life, that you can imagine in some sort of novella that I might have time to read now, because thinking because people aren't dying as much. So I think once we separate that pressure that a lot of, I think, creative people have felt, that you have to produce something because now is the best time to produce. Once that kind of anxiety or shame or pressure kind of lifts, I think what we will be in store, and this is the same for music as well, I think we are in art. We are going to have a chaotic and wonderful avalanche of production. But, and then we can talk about politics, but we also need to fund that. And that has also been something that through the pandemic, no one's talking about, is funding for arts, making sure artists are able to survive while they are hugging their knees and waiting to get back on stage, or whatever that means for their art.
Yeah, Nora, spending so much time obsessed with Twitter, it's that's a refuge worse than any dystopic fiction.
You should see the inside of my head, man. It's so wicked. It's like, nah, I love it.
Yeah, as someone who spends too much time there too. Maybe a quick question for all three of you, and then we'll get to an audience question. What has surprised you during this pandemic? Maybe something that you maybe could never have expected. A few for me is I didn't expect there to be so many bad actors. Maybe I'm naive on this. So many people who are willfully trying to undermine what is the right thing to do. But if you look back at the influenza pandemic of 1918, you had the same people doing the stuff who didn't want to wear masks, who were undermining science and that sort of thing. But also just kind of personally just watching how different friends react to this, and friends that I thought would be able to would be totally cool as a cucumber in anything, are racked with anxiety about this, and other people have all this inner strength about it. And it's been really interesting. This mostly plays out on Facebook and Twitter a bit, seeing how people are reacting day to day to it, and that's sort of been an interesting surprise about it. How about you guys?
My quick answer to that is the activism. I mean, there were 3,000 people that came out to protest the police in the middle of a pandemic in Quebec City. The last time we had a police protest because police killed someone here, there may have been 200 people. And so I have faith that people will rise up. I have faith that people will organize and that they will hear these calls to action and take action. But to see that has been... I have been very surprised. I've been surprised in a very good way, and not surprised oh, wow, finally people are actually taking stuff seriously. But we went from being afraid to leave our house to tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting anti-Black racism and police brutality. And I'm on perpetual cloud nine because of that.
Yeah, some of the folks in Calgary were really in awe. Sure. They said Calgary is not a city that has a history of protest. The biggest, one of the reporters there said the biggest that they've ever seen at City Hall or something would have been 100 people, give or take. And you had thousands out, and that was amazing. To see
Georgetown, Ontario, where I grew up, and I do not recommend anyone go there because it's not great. And if you're tuning in, you're from Georgetown, I'm super sorry for that. 1,000 people protested in Georgetown, and this is a town that is known for known to be racist. I mean, there is something happening, and I think that the downtime that people have had, we've talked about this on the podcast. Sandy Hudson mentioned this. The downtime that people have had to think and to reflect on their lives has actually sparked a lot of action as well, and so that's just really wonderful.
Great. Shree or Thea? Surprises
for me, one, it's been a bit, I'm sorry to say, but it's been clarifying in the sense of, although I've been doing this work on anti-oppression, I tend to have rose-colored glasses, and I tend to think, try to take people at face value, or believe people when they say they're sorry, or believe people when they say they care. And the pandemic leaves me with no such excuse. It's the layers of oppressions are too stark to ignore, even for me. So I hope that's true for people who are otherwise blind to it. But also the cruelty. I know there's been a lot of caring, and I know people have been, doing, volunteering and dropping food and making things and knitting, scarves. And I recognize and appreciate all of that. But the undercurrent of it all, there is, not just the stockpiling, which is fine. In the country of plenty, we can laugh it off as just hoarding behavior. But the ability to, unthinkingly go to cottages, for instance, without even in this moment reflecting on whose land. There is this crushing weight of injustice that has become so obvious, and it surprises me that it's not that obvious to everybody. Like, what more has to happen for, sometimes I want to shake some of these people and say, what more has to happen for you to wake up? People are literally dying. People are, protesting on streets. They're taking risks with their lives to make you see what's going on, to protest something that is for their humanity. What more has to happen? And I still see these, same old conversations about, what's school going to mean, what clothes are going to mean, what, and there is an unthinkingness that I still see, which bothers me deeply. And another aspect I do reflect upon a lot in this pandemic is space, and the concept of how much space has meant wealth, and how social distancing also has, outside of psychological impacts, it also has, it's also a physical privilege. Who can socially distance and who might not even have a yard, and who cannot distance at all, who has to hunker down, sorry. And this has always been, to me, in an urban setting like this, the deepest impact of it has been on Black lives. And so when I see people now worrying about, talking about anti-Black racism, but not talking about all the conditions that led to that anti-Black racism, and not reflecting on themselves, there's no point attaching a hashtag. There is no point doing all of that unless people start reflecting and having some contrition for their own contribution. And I don't see that. It bothers me deeply at this point. So I think, these are all things in my range of surprise and disillusionment. Sorry, I wish I had a positive thing to say, but I don't. Yeah.
Actually, I do have somewhat uncharacteristically positive thing to say, is that I think the thing that surprised me was actually, especially early on, how many sacrifices people were willing to make. And I think that's because, again, when you look at popular pandemic narratives, it's always just like people looting, basically, which I think we all are clear on how that idea is sort of both racialized and classist. But like, there's a scene in Outbreak where a mother holding a baby like attacks a doctor in a hazmat suit. It's actually absurdly hilarious, which is not the intention of the scene. And I think I've been really fascinated by how, early on there were so many businesses that were willing to suspend operation before they were mandated to, so many offices that moved home. And then when we think about people who couldn't stay at home and who kept working and going to their posts, and who did that, when we think about the long-term care workers, there were so many people who continued to work under terrible conditions, very low pay, and in some ways gave their lives. And so when I think about all those different groups of people across many different sectors of our economy, the willingness that they had to make sacrifices, it surprises me. I think fiction doesn't feed on goodness, because goodness is not always interesting. Like, goodness can happen at the end of the story, but it can't always be the instigating event. And it was really, I think, meaningful for me to see how sometimes there can be things that are better than what we put in our news or we put in our stories.
Thanks, Thea. We have 2 questions from the audience, and we maybe have like 10 minutes of questions. So if you have one, you can fire off. We might be able to have time for it too. So the first one is for Nora specifically. In your episode with Sandy called "We Have Already Won," you both talk about how perception of the police in the public sphere will never go back to what it was prior. Are we at a similar point in regards to understanding how harmful our current models of long-term care are?
I think that we are not. And the reason why I think we are not is because the difference in how people talked about the police before we were imagining that we could defund the police, and today, like, there's a tangible difference. And it has opened a lot of people's minds to saying, wait a minute, what do the police do? It questions a lot of dogma that we're fed and that we believe, and that's connected to a lot of forces within our lives that we believe to be good and protecting us, whatever that might mean for every individual. Long-term care has always had a bad rap because it has always not been sufficient. And the problem is that it's tied up with disability and the ableist nature of society. And so what I mean by that is, the reason why it has happened the way it has in long-term care is because it is a segment of the population that we have already said we don't care about them structurally. And the system has been built up around that indifference towards people in long-term care. And even though we're seeing this moment where we can't believe so many people were able to die, it's not as like last year, if you had a loved one who was about to go into long-term care, you'd be like, yes, long-term care, it's so great. The conditions are wonderful. My loved one is going to have a wonderful remaining year in their life, right? That's not how we understand long-term care to operate in this country. That being said, I think that the way movements work is really important. There has not really been a movement to change long-term care yet, but there is a consensus among everybody, regardless of political stripe, that there is a crisis in there. With the police, it's quite different. There's not a consensus that we should defund the police. There's not even a consensus that police are bad. And so how do you force a situation where you have a consensus that there's a problem, but the real solutions are going to be what's actually opposed by politicians? And I think it's going to be up to people organizing. I would like to see civil disobedience and actions taken directly against politicians to say, like, this is actually unacceptable, that we actually don't accept the way that long-term care exists in this country to continue. And we want it to be public. We want those public facilities to have workers who are well paid. We want to see workers who are working full time. We want to see people's final years spent in dignity. We want to see people who live with disabilities and who require intense care to have a dignified existence for the rest of their hopefully long lives. So I think that there's a different kind of conversation than defunding the police. And I am a bit pessimistic about our ability to force politicians to change things. But I also think that this is a really important moment where we should be able to build new social services from nothing to carry us through, a future century, that once we emerge from the virus, that we can, rebuild a new utopic existence.
Thanks, Nora. Another question, and this is for everyone. What do you feel has been the impact of Canadians seeing the impact of COVID in the United States? Which is a good question. I think the Canadian condition is partially half what paying attention to America, because they're so big and we're the little thing riding on top of them. But this one has been a difficult one for me because we are, I think, kind of watching it in a bit of horror, hopefully not smugly, because we obviously have, troubles of our own here. But also feeling, I think most of us probably have American friends, or people, friends who live in America, and how hard it must be. What do you guys think? The impact of being so close to what's going on in America. The entire world is watching what's happening in America, and Canadians and Mexicans are the ones who are closest to it.
I mean, I hard to say what the impact is at this point, but I can think of what I hope the impact isn't, which is that I think as Canadians, we tend to, I guess, sometimes smugly enjoy looking at how bad things can be in the US. And a lot of things that are, terrible systemic problems here, we think of as not bad, because compared to the US, it looks good. I lived in the US for a few years, and I often had to bite my tongue when people would talk to me about how wonderful our healthcare system is. Because of course, compared to the richest country in the world where people don't have access to healthcare, I mean, it's absurd. Of course, our system looks so much better than that. But at the same time, I mean, as we've talked about so much today, there are so many problems with our healthcare system. And I think we sort of are enabled by their chaos to say that everything up here is fine because it looks good compared to them. So I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that all the problems that in Canada that coronavirus have brought to light aren't ignored because things are so awful down there.
Shree?
Yeah, well, who are we kidding? We are very, very smug when we look at the US. The US imperialism is a very successful project in Canada, not just for the size, but also its outsized influence in our thinking, in our, understanding of pop culture, in our understanding of even how we situate ourselves. Like, for instance, when I first came to Canada, I noticed most people used to say, well, in North America, that's not how we do, or that's what we do, or it's a North America. Whereas in the US, nobody says North America. They're not thinking about Canada at all, right? They're just talking about the US. And so I think we've been so fascinated by what goes on in the US. I think I'm, I know that people think we have the First Amendment here and Miranda rights here and, all of that, which we don't. But I worry about even comparing ourselves. I know we are inextricably linked to the US through history and through geography, but at the same time, I worry that our fascination with with all the expressions of whether it's health inequities, whether it's racial inequities, the linkages, all of that, we are so fascinated by how they are expressed there, and they have really great data collection compared to us, that it erases what's happening here. We're not just interested in them as a species of people that we're getting some ghoulish delight out of. We are interested at the cost of ourselves. And so we are able to, feel smug when we need to, be a part of that bigger, Five Eyes alliance politically when we need to, and yet then use all of that information overload from the US to be able to say that, well, it's all happening in the US, and we don't know if it's happening here because we don't collect data, we don't read authors who are Canadian, we don't have enough Canadian content in our understanding of what's going on other than just the top political news, and so we end up erasing it. So yeah, I mean, yes, it's a shit show there with Donald Trump, and that's clear, and that's a pretty low bar. But we knew we couldn't expect any more anyway. So it's going as expected, and we have to not only be better, but we have to focus on how we could be better reflections of what we have even been up to now.
We got a couple minutes left. Do you have a quick answer for that one, Nora?
Yeah, the one thing I maybe will point to is the impact that it might have on our politics is quite interesting. Like, the Conservative Party is in a mess in Canada. They often look to the United States for ideas and for tactics and for public policies, and they can't right now. And so how the O'Toole-McKay show will kind of navigate this, and how the Conservative Party will figure out their new path with Donald Trump completely melting down, will be quite interesting. It's also, I mean, like, in the beginning, from the perspective of Quebec, the majority of our infections came from the United States. And it came from the United States because there's such a lot of connections to the United States, right? It's not just friends, it's families, it's people who've got homes on either side of the border. And I think that seeing, like, the United States is a warning sign to Canada as well, because they have not been able to get the virus under control, because they opened too quickly, because they prioritized, allowing people to go to bars rather than not, But Montreal is opening up their bars, and we're seeing a similar level of, not similar level of outbreaks, but new outbreaks happening. So, I mean, I really hope that we see this and take the good lessons, which are, we need to continue to socially distance, we need to continue to have things closed down, and I'm forgetting my last point. Well, anyway, but it's the warning sign for us, and we need to take it very seriously. So, thanks.
A quick one for Thea. Where do we go from here with fiction? Are there relevant fictional scenarios that do not involve pandemic living?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if that's John Deegan from the Writers Union. My kind has come calling. So I think recently Dionne Brand wrote a piece where she talked about how, as a Black writer, she's already been living in a pandemic that started long before coronavirus. And that's also a sentiment that I heard Jael Richardson share on Twitter too. And Wabgashig Rice, in talking about Moon of the Crested Snow, has also said that the apocalypse happened for Indigenous people, a long time ago. And so I think, we should have already been reading the writings of Black and Indigenous writers. If we weren't, it's really our loss. But this is a time more than ever, I think, that if you want to kind of understand what does it mean to live under crisis, you would be well served to look to the writings of writers like Dionne Brand, Jael Richardson, Moon of the Crested Snow, which actually is about pandemics, sorry. But really, I think any of the amazing writers that we have.
Thanks. We are just about out of time. So I had a question that I want to know what gives you hope right now, maybe just something really quick in the last minute that we have left. And you've already mentioned a few hopeful things in the midst of less hopeful things, but maybe it's nice to end on a hopeful note. What is the thing that you keep I don't know, looking to think about as you go to bed to push the terrible things out of your head?
I guess this is a terrible thing, but I think one thing that gives me hope is actually the hopelessness, that I think that will actually spur, things to be different. I keep seeing a meme on Instagram that says we don't want things to go back to normal. We want to recognize how bad normal was. And I hope that that's true.
Nora?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One kind of small thing that I take a lot of hope in is seeing how much scientific research is really it's necessary, and not just commercialized research. That there's people that are really angry to see that someone's going to make money off of a vaccine, and so seeing the basic research done in the public good to try and save the problems of humanity, I think that's really cool. And I also can't believe that the leading vaccine researcher has triplets, so that is amazing. They're adult triplets now, and she experimented on them. There's a good story out there today on that.
I wonder how many home experiments are going on with all the kids and workers, no matter what the field is. You have this test audience here. Shree, sorry.
Just a quick one. Hopeful that the children, my children and children like mine, are fortunate in a way that they have seen how interconnected we are as human beings already. It's something that a lot of even older people are seeing only now, and I'm very hopeful that if that is a taste of something they've got at this age, then that becomes the basis of their thinking and their planning and their dreaming for the future. So hopefully they keep that as a lesson.
Well, thanks to the three of you for sharing your work and your thoughts on this. I look at this mostly alone because I work from home alone, even before the pandemic, and I see the world through Twitter. So it's really nice to have a thoughtful conversation like this with smart people. And thanks to Word on the Street for, I guess, organizing this. It's one of my favorite events, when it's always like walk out to the Queen's Park or Queen's Quay now where it's at, and you see thousands of people there who want to buy books, and that is one of those hopeful moments when you hear about all the other bad news in the industry. So thank you to everyone who tuned in, and I'll throw it back to David.
Thank you, Shawn, and thanks to our panelists for sharing your thoughts and insights on how Canada has responded to the difficulties that this pandemic has presented and exposed. And thanks everyone for tuning in. As I mentioned, City Imagines, our series exploring books that shape cities, continues next week on Monday, July 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time with a conversation with Fit Cities author Dr. Karen K. Lee. Black Alchemy, presented in partnership with The Fold, takes place the following week on Monday, July 27th. Details and registration are available on our social media accounts and at cityimagines.ca. If you'd like to support The Word on the Street and events like this one, please visit thewordonthestreet.ca and click the donate button. Thanks for joining us and have a great evening.